Welcome everybody to a very intimate setting here today. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to announce that we have actually two upcoming events. The next one is next week. Dr. Yin Kerr, who's assistant professor at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, speaking about 6 Southeast Asian artists. The week after that is a talk about religion in the Philippines. But that is all on our website. Anyway, we're very pleased to have, please come in. We're very pleased to have with us today Dr. Anjeline de Dios, who is a colleague from Lingnan. And I should say, Lingnan colleagues have been coming to CERC on a fairly regular basis recently. We had a talk not too long ago about Myanmar. Anjeline has just started last semester at Lingnan, so we didn't wait long before asking you to come to speak to us here. She's a cultural geographer, a singer and chant performer with an interest in geographies of music, migration, mobility, cultural and creative labor. As I said, currently a assistant professor of cultural studies at Lingnan, and I should say also Angeline's talk today sort of is an indication of CERC's desire to have more talks in the sort of cultural studies direction. So we're very pleased that you've come, and thank you for helping us broaden our horizons. We've tended to have a bit of a politics, economics, political economy bias in the past, so we're very pleased. Thanks again for coming, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you.
Sa piling ng may kapal, sa diwa ng mutyang dangal, aking aawitin. Nakikinig nangangamba, nagdadasal, nagsasamba. Ako ba'y henyo o hangal? Sa piling ng may kapal. When I sing, I always have the feeling that the space I am singing in and singing into is listening to me. Even when no one is there, and even when there are people present, as in this case, there is a sense of consciousness gathering around the sound I choose to make, the sound I dare to make, anticipating the launch and holding the resonance that follows. It is because of this listening, diffuse yet attentive, imagined yet felt, wholly external to me, yet fully of the mood and the mind of me from which this voice chooses to sound. That singing, and I would suggest all kinds of making music, is inevitably a working out of the self in relation to an other, through what can be seen and heard and felt in particular spaces and times of that encounter with the other. What I try to do today is to unpack the different senses of this relationality between the self and the other as the condition through which music is made. And conversely, how certain relations with other selves emerge from this embodied and contextual space of music making. In other words, the question I want to work through today, which is really just another iteration of a question that I've been working through for the past 8 years, is how this mode of singing, this mode of listening and making music and thinking of that relationally, how is that articulated? How is that rendered recognizable and legible, audible, therefore amenable to participation, to change, to circulation, and yes, evaluation and judgment? How is all of this articulated through the filter, through the scale of being Filipino, in the particular formation of this national, cultural, and racial identity? So I draw from 3 entanglements of research and not research within Filipino vocal and musical performance in transnational contexts. What I'll be talking about for the most part today, because it's the material I'm most comfortable with talking about, having worked on it for quite a while for my PhD research, is based on the work I've done on the geographies of migrant musicianship, particularly among Filipino entertainers who work in cruise ships, in theme parks, and in hotels and restaurants. So this made for very fun field work. And this is a photo that I took in December 2012 at Hong Kong Disneyland. Although I'm not supposed to say Hong Kong Disneyland, it's a place called Happy Land, which employs a very large number of Filipino entertainers, dancers, musicians. What you see here is a picture of the marching band composed at the time, in 2012, it was 80% Filipino nationals who had been working in Disneyland trying to cap their 7 years so they could get their permanent residency and move their families over. Most of them had already kind of moved their families over. And almost all of these horn players in the marching band came from the Conservatory of Music in the Philippines. So this research was conducted from 2012 to 2013. I interviewed around 70 singers, musicians, and their agents in leisure venues. I narrowed it down to 3 kinds of venues: hotels, cruise ships, and theme parks in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in Manila and Cebu, which I pinpointed as 2 major destinations from 2 major points of origin for these musicians, and Penang. And I also went on a cruise for field work. Another entanglement, or another kind of site of engagement and research that is ongoing, is the research that I'm doing on artist-run performing and contemporary arts ensembles, also from the Philippines. So I'm looking at 2 specific groups. The picture you see on top is a picture of Daloy Dance Company. It's a small ensemble of contemporary dancers of different backgrounds. Their artistic director used to be prima ballerina of Ballet Philippines. She worked for a time in the States. Then she migrated back to the Philippines to set up her own contemporary dance troupe. And the second group that I'm looking at is an all-male choir called Aleron. They recently competed in France and Spain. They're a very young, very ambitious group of music professionals. Quite a good number of them have become classical musicians, pursuing that career full-time. But most of them are professionals. They're doctors, they're lawyers, they're businessmen. And then they pursue this engagement with the chorale. So both Aleron and Daloy, although they seem to occupy the opposite end of the first group of musicians I'm looking at, you have your entertainers on the one end, and then you have quote-unquote serious artists on the other end. And then what I'm doing with my research, with my engagement with the 2, because I do creative projects, particularly with Daloy, the kind of improv chanting that I just demonstrated for you right now, I find that the kinds of questions, the kinds of concerns, and the logics by which they made sense of their decision, their constant decision to keep making music, struggling with and always relating to the indelible framework of a Filipino identity. These were things that I found were they had more resonances than dissonances between these two kinds of artists. So as a performer myself, and I hesitate because I'm not like a usual performer. So when people find out that I'm Filipino, and then they find out in a second instance that I sing, you know, they expect me to sing a certain way. And there's always a point of discomfort, and then after the point of discomfort, there's a point of curiosity, like, why am I uncomfortable? Especially when people try to ask, try to kind of pin down, what are you doing with your voice? If you're a singer and you're a Filipino, what kind of music do you do? So my own stuff, chant performer is a term that I just made up, and I'm not really comfortable with it yet. But I can't find that term that kind of describes what I want, what I try to do. So I do a lot of improv. I sing with a jazz group. I am beginning to do some projects with sound artists in the Philippines. All of this is in very informal, kind of friendly context. A friend who's doing this, putting up this event, and they want somebody to just kind of ululate in the background while they're doing things with lights. And there's an involvement that I do in meditation. So I practice yoga, and I'm very interested in kind of forms of sound meditation and sound therapy. And the interest comes with a lot of kind of academic trepidation about cultural appropriation and about why such practices of spirituality, so-called New Age spiritual practices, why is it having a moment here? And then what is it enabling in terms of cultural practices, on top of all the usual debates that we have about authenticity and cultural identity. So how do I map this out for today? I have 4 concepts in question that I try to use as points to kind of track the kinds of reflections that I'm making along these 3 areas of research. So the first concept is that of Filipino-ness. It's a vector of identity along racial, cultural, and national lines. I use the term, I sometimes use the term racial identity to describe Filipino-ness, but I also want to put an asterisk here and underline that there is a kind of imprecision in translation when you talk about Filipino-ness. The Filipino or the Tagalog word for Filipino usually is lahi. So lahi means life. It means it has the racialized biological connotations of blood. So in that sense, it's sort of like race as a category, but at the same time, lahi is also used as a kind of social term of collectivity and belonging. So it has that constructivist notion of a nation. And it's very hard to kind of describe that complex subjectivity of the collective in English. So that's the asterisk that I want to put that there. Put when I talk about every time I talk about Filipino-ness. And of course, the term itself embeds within it other delineations of collective subjectivity. I mean, to speak of a Filipino-ness requires a kind of sensitivity to the fact that there is a Tagalog-speaking majority. There are ethno-linguistic majorities that more often than not in scholarship gloss over the tremendous diversity of ethno-linguistic groups throughout the region. Taking into consideration as well the other delineations of class, gender, and sexuality, and regional identities. A second concept that I pin in this talk is the concept of authenticity, and to a lesser extent, originality. And I approach these concepts as values that are infrastructural, in the sense that they're hidden. You don't really notice that they're there, but they somehow shape the conditions and the circumstances by which one person defines themselves in context to another person. So I'm interested in the concept of authenticity, not just in terms of the usual debate about judging music as fake or genuine or good or bad, but really in perceiving certain forms of music making in the first place as valid or invalid expressions of culture. A third concept that I'm talking about today is the concept of music as labor. What do we mean by that? Music as labor. Here I talk about it really in two senses. First is the sense of music as an embodied, ephemeral work that is done live. I think we take for granted nowadays that the landscape of music in terms of its production and consumption is really done through many different kinds of mediations. Forgetting that to think of music as a product that is performed live, it's not really a product, but it's somewhere in between, an experience and a service, and that this ambiguous status of music as live, to be consumed and experienced and produced live, has very long colonial histories, very long histories of technology that get glossed over because our standard and our standard language for evaluating and thinking about music is really through mediation. So I try in my work to really foreground that when we're talking about music, we can't not think about the way that it is live and it is embodied. And because it is live and embodied, it brings with it inseparable structures of embodied differentiation. So it matters very much, for instance, when a Filipino musician explains to me, well, Filipino musicians are cheap because we're not that black and we're not that white. That's probably going to be the title of my book. When my respondent said that, I thought about that for days. What does he mean that musicians are not that black and not that white? And what does that afford? What does that afford these musicians that they cannot be pinned down to, to a certain market's conception of what an authentic performer should look like? So the second sense really of music as labor refers to this, the sense that the experience and the status of music as embodied brings certain economies that shape practices of live performance. So when we think about the usual ways we categorize and make sense of music, well, this one's art, this one's just entertainment, this one is jazz, this one is this one is for amateurs, this one's for fun because it's a community engagement. So something like a meditation session, right, is supposed to be welcoming to all, but an improvisation jam between jazz musicians who've been working together for 20 years is somehow off limits to amateurs. So even the dichotomy between professional and amateur are very kind of loaded categories that I feel stem from this ambiguity of music as labor. And then the final concept that I want to look at is this notion of reputation. So two things about reputation. At the beginning of my research, my primary conceptual focus was Filipino identity. But the more and more I talked to musicians, I realized that the thing that kept coming up for them was the word reputation. And they had many layers of meaning behind this issue, this hot button topic of reputation. The number one thing that came out among the musicians, particularly in Hong Kong that I spoke to, mentioned that the reputation of the Filipino musician has gone down because of this new group of musicians who allow themselves to be undercut, who allow themselves to be exploited and abused. So that brings everybody down. So right away I realized that there was a tension between an individual reputation and a collective reputation. Furthermore, I feel that this concept of reputation has has very kind of deep involvements in audience spaces. So different kinds of audiences will require different mechanics of reputation. You will have to define, if you're a performer representing yourself to an audience, you will have to define yourself differently according to the geography of that audience space. So a Filipino who is in a competition, for a Filipino choir for instance, like the artists that I look at, who are in competition with a choir from Indonesia, a choir from Russia, a choir from the United States, they will have a very kind of distinct performance of their reputation and of their identity as Filipino. And then that reputation will change once they're in a space with all other Filipino choirs. Then suddenly the significance, the semiotic significance of being Filipino completely changes, but it's still there. So I began, it was a bit of an experiment for me to begin singing. I have never sung in an academic presentation before. And I was up until maybe 3 a.m. last night fretting over how I was going to explain it and justify it as part of the research. But let me do it this way. I started singing, my first memory of singing was doing just that, humming. No song, no words. And 30 plus years since that early memory of kind of, I didn't know it at the time, but I was kind of putting myself into a trance. And I'm guessing that it's not unique to me. I think many children have a very creative and a very kind of intuitive way of singing that eventually gets kind of cut up and categorized into different things. How it got cut up and categorized for me as a Filipino, as a young girl who loved to sing and who grew up in a culture that privileged singing a certain way, but privileged a certain kind of singing. And the singing that is privileged here in the Philippines is choral singing. To sing while Filipino is in the first instance to find yourself in the frequent company of other people singing and other people listening. In choirs, we sing and we listen to one another, and our voices become a contact zone for this mutual production of sound and a common effort towards harmony. Not that that harmony immediately leads to equality, as we'll see later. The symbolic space produced by this collective song is a powerful one with the capacity to not only imagine but embody the myth of the national community. I discovered this meaning-making power in 2006 when, as part of the Ateneo Chamber Singers, the alumni choir of my alma mater, Ateneo de Manila, I performed in cities in France and Spain on a typical competition tour that eventually culminated in a victory in the mixed choir category in the 38th Tolosa Choral Competition. We bested rivals from Indonesia, France, and Russia. The Indonesian choir was really the best. They went on to win many other competitions while we won maybe 2 more in the 10 years since then. So it was the first time, I mentioned this, I'm in the very center. It was the first time I had triumphed for and on behalf of my country, and as we exulted in the announcement, cheering and frantically waving our little Philippine flags as though we'd won an Olympic gold medal in the presence of the other choirs, part of me wondered what it was that I was actually celebrating. Why did our hard-won, highly personal victories seem to resonate proportions that exceeded the present moment? Without downplaying the significance of that moment, I know now that our triumph in Tolosa as a choir reflected and upheld the broader institutional infrastructure around choral performance as a world-class site of Filipino culture, inaugurated by none other than the ex-First Lady, Imelda Marcos of the Philippine Madrigal Singers in the late 1960s. So the patronage of Imelda Marcos of the Philippine Madrigal Singers in the 1960s then paved the way for professional choirs to participate in international contests representing the Philippines for the next 50 years. The centuries-long colonization of the Philippine Islands by Catholic Spain, beginning in 1521, was solidified by, among other things, the systematic implementation of Baroque European music performance practices in villages and towns clustered around the parish, polyphonic singing, choral singing, and symphonic instrumentation like marching bands. which lowland communities adopted with astonishing rapidity and fervor. So today choirs, I'm saying, have become a central pillar in Philippine cultural and social life. Choirs feature in all levels and regions, in schools, churches and companies, in large clans and groups of friends, in prisons and in villages. To sing while Filipino, then, is to perform for and as an audience, and this audience consists of a relational space. A space with many layers of meaning where senses of subjectivity expand and shift fluidly in ways we only subsequently parse through the language of scale. Individual to community to nation, locality and globality. This is not unique, I would say, to any notion or question of Filipino-ness. But I would argue what is distinct is that scholarly and popular accounts of Philippine music making, and particularly of singing, have tended to flatten the complexity of this relational labor to a highly problematic degree. The sight and sound today of the Filipino singer, that globally ubiquitous, exemplary mimic of Western or Anglo-American popular music specifically, has long provoked a sense of frustrated melancholy among audiences seeking Filipino cultural tradition, something unique, something authentic. Pico Iyer is an Indian-British-American writer whose meditations on travel and globalization exemplify this romantic nostalgia for this post-colonial nostalgia for authenticity. So I'm quoting here a very interesting excerpt from his 1988 travel memoir, Video Night in Kathmandu. In the book, he travels to many cities and villages in East and Southeast Asia, and he was hoping to find enduring practices of local and native cultures amidst the globalizing sweep of McDonald's and Michael Jackson in the mid to late 1980s. And he's clear, based on this excerpt, that what he encounters in the Philippines is emblematic of his melancholic thesis, the erasure of locality and distinctiveness in favor of performance that is skilled yet soulless, polished yet inferior. The flawless imitations of the bands that Iyer witnessed in his 1980s visit to the Philippine cities of Manila and Baguio reiterate the conventional reading of Filipinos as uncritical consumers and subjects of their former imperial master, perhaps lacking the instinct or the inclination or even the intelligence to express a distinctive cultural self. It's a polemical refrain familiar to many of us, and one that, as art historian Patrick Flores asserts, takes on either one of two moments in the face of the Filipino singer as exemplary mimic. The first is the colonial, post-colonial critique proposed by Iyer, and the second moment is a nativist stance that has as its goal the recovery, or at least the rearticulation, of an aesthetically distinctive cultural formation that would take its rightful place in the global imaginary of musical practices. Under this second position, I would file institutional and commercial infrastructures to produce world-class and original Filipino music, which is a marketing industry term that is used in the domestic popular music industry in the Philippines. So both disciplinary intellectual moments are valuable in their imperative to dismantle prevailing intellectual imperialisms. But the trouble with these two moments of reckoning, post-colonial and nativist, carried through to logics of truth claims, is that they arguably reinforce a long-standing myopia or a deafness regarding music, not only as a form of relational labor, as I spoke of earlier, but as relational labor enlisted specifically for the contemporary transnational economies of migration and creative work. Again, I refer to the labor of music in two senses, as embodied performance, such as the in situ production of music for an audience, and the organization, representation, and management of creative work in the creative industries. So, judging by the literature, this deafness, this myopia regarding relational musical work takes the form of a scholarly and popular fixation, an obsession with authenticity, and originality or authorship, two dominant regimes of value that demarcate what I refer to as the core creative industries of popular music. Left unquestioned, these regimes of value preclude the possibility of listening to migrant histories of song. I would say also informal and community-based practices of producing music, as with my colleagues in contemporary art and choral music. So these histories that don't fit the evaluative criteria for legitimate Filipino music. Histories that are very accurately captured by this photo. It's a 1924 photo from the Philippines Free Press, and it depicts an all-Filipino jazz band performing for dancers in Tokyo's Imperial Hotel. They were just about to take on another performing contract on a trans-Pacific Japanese ship. Research shows that this was just one of hundreds of similar ensembles between 1910 and 1930 who performed hits from the US for mostly white expatriate audiences in cities stretching from Lahore and Bombay to Batavia, Surabaya, Beijing, and Yokohama. The sojourns of performance of these musicians in cruise ships, dance halls, military bands, classical orchestras throughout colonial Asia, these formed deep grooves along the imperial circuits of trade, popular culture, and modernity, which transformed the region and the globe in the late 19th to early 20th century. While this local Philippine headline triumphantly depicts the Filipino musicians' presence as conquering the market, the reality, as the ethnomusicologist Fritz Schenker has found through archival research, is that Filipino musicians were highly valued for their musicality and paid significantly lower, treated significantly worse than their more authentic counterparts from the US and Europe. As skilled and in-demand musicians, they traveled with astonishing ease and breadth throughout Imperial Asia, not just as performers, but also as music educators, arrangers, and composers. While recognized for their competence and talent, as colonial subjects, they faced systemic discrimination and oppression, both by their employers and audiences, as well as their fellow foreigners. When we leave unexamined the assumption that music's cultural and economic value is measured only by the production of original and authentic music, consistent with an essentialist notion of cultural identity, we fail to recognize not just the complexity of musical practices, but on a deeper level, we fail to recognize the real presence of discrimination against creative workers on the basis of race and gender in the workplace. A discrimination emergent not only in the cultural politics of musical authenticity, as I've said, but especially in the cultural politics of the wage, to use a phrase by Jeff Mann. This is a quote by Cerise in an interview I conducted with her just last year. Cerise is one of the most well-respected and established live music performers in Hong Kong. She's Filipino and has been here for more than 20 years. She has performed in Clock and Flap. She has had a recording career, but her main gig is performing in hotels and private functions. So remember that she is already at the top of the heap. There is nowhere else for her to go as a live performer here in Hong Kong. But this quote of hers, to me, illustrates perfectly this contemporary reality of singing while Filipino or singing while Filipina. And it is one where in her rich subjectivity as a performer, her reputation that she has built herself, that is all subsumed by a larger racial reputation of value, a reputation she can't control, but to which she is unavoidably welded, with a particular audience here in Hong Kong that has registered Filipino-ness in a certain way. Here's another quote by a musician named Fernan, who has worked in Singapore and India and South Korea, but has since moved back to the Philippines. Fernan was the guy who described Filipino musicians as not that black and not that white. And he's my best respondent. I didn't even have to prompt him. He had obviously thought about this for a very long time, because he did have a recording career before he decided to go into migrant entertainment. And notice how, in his understanding, Filipino-ness is defined by its ambivalent positioning by different groups of racialized others, Westerners and other Southeast Asians. And how the Filipino brand, is premised on the very same notion of economic cheapness and hyperflexibility, which so angered Cerise. I think it's interesting to counterpose Cerise and Fernand's insights, because Fernand helps us remember that a great number of musicians are not like Cerise, and we cannot expect any labor market of musicians to possess or to display just one kind of musician or one level of aesthetic or musical excellence. Many musicians are not like Cerise, that is, they are not top-tier performers with more clout and experience. Fernand here articulates a view of how he is viewed, or what he hears when another person hears him. I'll return to this notion in a minute, because this is how some contemporary philosophers define reputation. It is how I view that person viewing me. Here I underline that it is through Fernand's lived observation and experience of the demand for Filipinos in transnational workplaces that he equates with the Filipino brand and with the formula cheaper but better than most. And this is all we have. To understand a little more deeply how this relational discourse of racialized self-worth emerges through the process and mobility of musical labor, I talk in my research about different geographies of performance, and I came to the conclusion that more than the destination country, what shapes the experiences and what shapes the range of agency that musicians have to forward themselves, to shape their reputation on their own terms, really has to do with the actual performance venue where they are. So if you are a theme park performer in Macau or in Hong Kong with a different management structure, you will have a different contract, a different experience than somebody who is on a 3-month contract in a hotel with no direct supervisory relationship with F&B management, for instance. It also, I think the geography of the actual performance spaces of liveness also shapes the kind of work that these musicians do. What is the quality of this musical labor? So, and it's very important when, again, we're thinking about music as something that's embodied, and specifically music that is entertainment. So this is a form of music where authenticity is basically out of the question. Simon Frith, the musicologist, calls it a secondary performance sector. So in this sector, you would put together your singing contestants on American Idol and Britain's Got Talent. You would put in this sector the wedding singer at your parents' 50th wedding anniversary. And then you would put in this sector the entertainers that you would see on a regular basis in these entertainment venues. What this picture shows is a pop and easy ballad quartet in a hotel in Singapore. You can't see it very well, but Fernand is right there. He's playing keyboards and he's the band leader. So I want to call attention to their location. So their stage isn't quite a stage. They're meant to be seen, so people pass in and out of this empty area in front of them. Sometimes they dance, but most of the time, they don't really pay attention to the musicians. One of my rookie mistakes as an ethnographer was that when I would sit and watch performances in hotels, is that I would be the only one clapping, and then I would reveal myself as somebody who was looking at the musicians, but nobody's supposed to be looking at the musicians. They're just there for background music. They're there to take your requests. They're there to create an atmosphere. So that is a very kind of clear and simple example of how the physicality and the location of performance kind of shapes the nature of the job itself. And the nature of the job is entertainment in 2 ways. As I've said, to produce an ambient soundscape, to accompany and encourage the main economic transactions of drinking and dining, and second, to interact with patrons both on and off stage, especially by taking requests. What I want to highlight at this point is that even though live music performs this very peripheral, almost like an afterthought, this kind of function of mood setting, it still always carries with it the possibility of performing the deeper effective labor of forging connection through listening for what people want to hear. So the labor of entertainment in music performance, as I see it, becomes a labor of listening to an audience, and in that process of listening to them, reading their mood, profiling them to guess, okay, well, this person drinks wine, he must like jazz. I'll play a jazz song and see how he reacts to it. So this kind of labor of listening, this relational labor, is really what I understand as a kind of effective work of turning customers into guests. It's summed up in this interview excerpt where Michael, a classically trained pianist and singer, who was on the way to building a classical music career, and then was lured by the possibility of going on an around the world cruise. Didn't know he wanted to take a break from teaching. He was single, so he did not follow the usual migrant story of having to provide for his family. You see more of these kind of explorer type migrants in musical work more than in more stereotypically migrant professions from the Philippines. So here Michael draws a very clear difference between being a musician and an entertainer. Notice here the complexity of sentiments and logics behind the work of entertainment. There's the reflection on his deepening subjectivity towards the familial act of putting one's music to work for the benefit of others. And there's the frank admission that this will earn the money. However, for Michael and many other migrant musicians, whose working lives are especially precarious, earning money for overseas remittances is in itself a kind of service labor to their left-behind families. So the gap between doing something for money and doing something out of a so-called creative individual impulse towards artistry, towards growth, the gap can be very narrow. The advantage of listening to the ordinary, inauthentic, and unoriginal performers that so bothered ear is that we are afforded a strong position to think about music, art, and creativity through migration, from the working lives of people who turn living song into living labor, to use a phrase by the visual studies scholar Sarita C. There's a need to reflect on the value of making music and what it means to make a living from music making in a way that acknowledges the material conditions of migration and the material conditions of forming and building communities with other people. In the context of contemporary Philippines, I'd argue that it's necessary to factor in the reconfiguration of migrant music work. So, traveling overseas to entertain foreigners on cruise ships has been a profession for Filipinos since at least the 1800s. But what we're seeing since the 1970s onward, with the institutional regime of overseas labor migration, the government itself acting as a broker and creating a discourse of migrant livelihood, overseas work being the only way that you can be a hero to your family and to your country. So that is a very kind of heavy-handed, pervasive discourse around migrant work. So we need to factor in this broader institutional and political change in the way that we understand this work of entertainment. So the chance to pursue a decent livelihood as an entertainer abroad, and I would argue to prove to people back home. So again, this relational labor of singing and earning one's keep through singing becomes significant for an audience of musicians who are proving to their families that I'm not, I dropped out of school for a good reason. I dropped out of school to join a band, and look at us now, I built you a house in the province. So there's a very kind of endearing defensiveness that I noticed with a lot of my musicians who had to, I think, more than Filipino migrants who go on to become nurses or even domestic workers, so-called respectable or stable jobs. There's a lot of suspicion still among families that you can't earn a decent living as a musician. So, and these kinds of discourses, these kinds of struggles, these emotional struggles are not at all captured in debates on authenticity and originality. So I would say for certain audiences that matter, the family, the community, the work of entertainment actually has very significant value attached to it, symbolic value attached specifically to being a good Filipino. I think I have 5 minutes left. Yeah. So while some of my musicians resented being lumped together with fellow Filipinos who displayed behavior of unprofessionalism, of in their view, subpar musical performance. I had one such musician who worked in a theme park, and he actually worked in Universal Studios, in Hong Kong Disneyland, and had since become a very kind of well-known singer in his own right. He went so far as to tell me that he had acquired a Singapore passport, and he frankly told me that I try to downplay my Filipino identity because the connotations of it are so negative. I just want my audiences, I want my bosses to see me as me. And then you have, on the other hand, an equally successful musician, Samantha, who's actually a very popular recording artist and theater actress in the Philippines, who wanted to take a break from the rigors of OPM music, so she decided to become an actress and stay. She said she worked in Disneyland for 3 years, and she loved it because she got all the benefits, and she had a very kind of short working day that she would never be able to get as a more prestigious artist in the Philippines. Later on, she became a cruise performer, and I was quite struck by how. Of course, it was sincere, but she was very determined to be humble. She was very determined to almost bring herself down to the level of the majority of Filipino workers on cruise ships, and they are waiters and engineering staff, service workers. So she invoked her Filipino identity, which for her was idiosyncratic and was valuable, but her Filipino-ness was not couched in the terms of originality or authenticity. It was couched in this discourse of flexibility and accommodation, which is a double-edged sword. So it's been taken up institutionally by the government as a way to say that the competitive advantage of Filipinos is, we might not be authentic performers, but we are flexible, we are versatile, we speak American style English, so people can understand us. So, and we, in terms of music itself, we perform any kind of music. We can do Air Supply, we can do Adele, we can do an Irish jig, we can rap. If you want us to do a Filipino song, we can do that too. So one thing that I'm still thinking about now is that more than one musician in different whether in Singapore, in Penang, or in the Philippines, has recounted to me that, from time to time some foreigner will ask us to sing Anak, which is the most popular, iconic, probably the only iconic Filipino penned global hit. It's been translated into, I think, more than 30 languages. And it was received very heavy airplay all throughout Southeast Asia and even globally at a certain period of time. I think it was the late 70s. So there's a certain bracket of hotel guests who, inspired by these musicians, feels this kind of indeterminate need to hear them sing their own music. So these musicians recount to me that they think they're doing us a favor by requesting that we sing a Filipino song, but on a certain level, it doesn't matter to them, right? It's just another song for them to sing. So on the one hand, there's a temporal sedimentation of meaning behind the racialization of reputation. Like their forebears nearly a century ago, the condition of migrant Filipino musicians today is marked by their ubiquity and their subordinate position compared to their local counterparts in destination countries. But on the other hand, the racialization is part of a much more recent and institutionalized programming of Filipino labor to suit vacant jobs in the global capitalist system. I think I should end here because we're just at around 45 minutes. We can talk more in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that fascinating talk, which combined a great performance at the beginning to all these insights about Filipino musicians and national and cultural identity. We have a little more than half an hour for questions, if there are any. And maybe while the audience is gathering its thoughts, I may offer two short vignettes of my own regarding Filipino musicians. CERC, the Southeast Asia Research Center here, held a cultural festival. I think it was about 5 years ago. And one of the hopes and plans for this was to have, singers and representing the various cultures of Southeast Asia. So it was proved relatively easy to get a Thai group, an Indonesian group, but it was much more difficult to get a Philippine group because the Filipino musicians, at least we had connections with, perhaps we needed better connections, but what we were working with were all professional musicians in Hong Kong. And therefore, unlike the other cultural performers, wanted to be paid. Whereas there's this genre of, people performing their national music for such cultural festivals. The Filipinos were in a different category, and we wound up hiring an excellent band, which, and this goes back to your fascinating line about indeterminate need for some to have Filipinos sing in Filipino. I'm certainly guilty of that. So I said to them, please sing in Tagalog. This is a cultural festival, please sing in Tagalog. And they looked a little bit nonplussed, not very excited about it. And the audience reaction, there were quite a few Filipinos there, was relatively subdued. And then since this was the end of the festival, they kept sort of looking at me, motioning to me whether I could sort of loosen up this remit. And they wound up singing Gangnam Style at the end with one of the musician's sons, 10-year-old, singing the lead. And the audience started rocking. And in fact, because it was in a venue where people could sort of come and go, all of a sudden I realized the audience had almost doubled. And it was a really interesting example, and I think it goes along with a lot of the things you're saying about how, supposed authenticity ran into, what was popular with the audience, what the band was wanting to sing. And I think it was a very interesting illustration of some of the points you're making. The second story is a shorter one, but involves a celebrity, a local celebrity, but also an international global celebrity, and that's Arnel Pineda, who, as you may know, recently gave a concert here in Hong Kong a couple of nights. He was a singer in Hong Kong hotels, probably elsewhere as well, but he was quite well known in the, as I understand it, in the 90s. Then became the lead singer for Journey, as Journey's lead singer had died. This is quite a story about how he auditioned for this and so on and became the lead singer. So even though he's a so-called secondary sector, as you were talking about, he all of a sudden is the primary, the singer for the band, and of course is part of this global brand, which is this rock band Journey. And when he came back to Hong Kong, it was a very exclusive performance. Tickets were extremely expensive, and there were many of the good and great from the Filipino community there. So it was a real change from this sort of hotel scene we were talking about, where people are relatively indifferent to the music, to this was an important musician because he was now, the lead singer for Journey. So I just offer that as two further examples of sort of the paradoxes that you're getting at. Further, Stefan?
Yeah, well, I probably have a stupid question. I'm just wondering why the Filipino people are so interested in music, or what institutional structures exist that musicians in the Philippines come out rather than in other Southeast Asian countries. Why is it so prominent in the Philippines that there are so many singers come out?
Are you talking about Western pop music or singing?
No, generally. Yeah, I'm just wondering how come they're like known as these versatile, cheap singers you mentioned that can do whatever you want. And it seems to be something like education that fosters music education or something.
Right, so that's a question I wrestle with all the time. And I have at least 10 possible answers for that. I would say it's a mishmash of many different things. So I mentioned Spanish colonial history. Very, very influential. Spanish colonial history and how it kind of built up from very early on. the importance of music as a social activity. But then again, you could here I find that it's very useful to keep like a comparative framework, because Goan musicians from India, colonized by the Portuguese, also exhibited similar patterns of migration in the 19th century. And when you read the press materials on these Goan musicians in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they're saying the same things that the Filipinos, right? So they were coded as particular colonial subjects who were, you know, skilled mimics with the usual anxieties from certain sectors about the cultural identity being erased by their enthusiastic embrace of Western cultural forms. So they're not unique in that respect. Is it education? I would say that Hong Kong has a much better, the Hong Kong and the US, I mean, look at the US, Germany, all these other different countries with way more determined and differentiated educational programs for Filipino, for musicians and for musical performance. You don't have that in the Philippines. Funding for the arts is extremely low, is incredibly low. And yet, one of the anecdotes that my respondents told me, so he was a performer at Disneyland, and he was taking lessons on the side to become certified as a teacher. So he noticed that, you know, children here have to pay money to play music. And it's completely different from a kind of very normal kind of village scene in the Philippines, or even in the peri-urban areas, where you would have the marching band practicing every week in the big open air court where the community would gather, and anyone could just sit in, you know, grab an instrument and play, and they would share the instruments among themselves, right? So I spent a number of years in Singapore doing my PhD at NUS, and I was quite saddened by the fact that there were no students playing guitar anywhere. And then that made me realize, okay, so that's something that I take for granted in the Philippines, that it's a daily feature of life. And the interesting thing is that this is not to say that indigenous practices do not exist. There are quite a lot of communities and economies centered exclusively on indigenous musics. But I think out of historical circumstance that the colonizer of the Philippines ended up developing what is now the infrastructure for the global popular music industry. You know, Filipinos within the Southeast Asian region had at least 100 years of getting used to Western classical and symphonic forms. So in the 40s, 50s, 60s, you had a wave of many music educators who were hired by the Royal Court of Thailand, who were hired by the Constabulary Band of Malaya to train local musicians there. So it's history, it's culture, it's economics. I think the most recent institutional factor would be the fact that it's become reconfigured as this migrant labor category to send remittances home. Yeah.
I have a couple of remarks more than questions. First of all, thank you very much for the singing. It was very interesting and unexpected.
Yeah.
I've always, I guess the Philippines have this part of their economy is based on this exploitation of labor, be it laborers in the Gulf or being maids in Hong Kong. And I assume that singers participating from the same movement, I think it's quite interesting that you showed that in the 1930s already there were these cruise ship groups. So I'm guessing the singers came first, and then laborers came second. I don't know if that's fair to say with proceeds from the very same movement.
I think they were parallel streams. They were.
Were there already physical labor moving away from the Philippines in the 30s? I know very little about that.
I'm not sure about that. Well, I'm not sure about plantation workers to the States. And I'm looking at Chris here because this would be like a field of American studies that I'm completely.
It was American colonization right after.
Right.
Yeah.
So early 20th century, you already had waves of male laborers migrating to Hawaii to work on the plantations.
California.
California, there you go. So ship workers also. So I'm completely unfamiliar with this strand of history, but I think even during the period of Spanish colonization, from the 16th to 17th centuries, you had kind of manual laborers already, which preceded the current domination of Filipino workers in the seafaring industry. So the interesting thing with musicians is that they were kind of privileged colonial subjects, because they were, and this is something that I talk about, that I try to unpack in my thesis and in the book. How do we place the skill of these musicians? You know, they are doing high-skilled work, but because they're not doing the correct kind of music, they're not considered as high-skilled workers. You know, they're not, so that's why they're completely absent from these contemporary accounts of creative work and creative industries. Yeah.
My second, sorry, I had a second remark.
Sure.
One of my friends is a Filipino singer in Hong Kong, and she mentioned this sort of playing down the reputation, playing down your identity as a Filipino, four questions of reputation. And I assume in her case she was telling, she doesn't look Filipino, if I may say, or lots of people mistake her from being from Latin America, particularly. And she sort of doesn't try to dispel that notion, in part because she was teaching as a teacher in a school on top of being a singer here in Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, of course, there's this association of Filipino with being maids, and I assume that was connected to that. She was playing down her Filipino identity because of that connection. But you seem to say that it's something, that reputation is something that actually quite global, that Filipino singers are perceived as being cheap singers and stuff.
Yeah. So thanks for bringing that up. The historian Filomeno Aguilar wrote a terrific essay in 1996 called Transnational Shame and Filipino Identity. And it was an essay based on his observation and historical work of different kinds or different classes of Filipino migrants within the same space. So mid-90s Singapore, you had a growing group of middle-class Filipino professionals who experienced the sense of what Aguilar called transnational shame, because you know the reputation, the racial reputation of Filipinos was with subordinate low-skilled labor. So even 20 years ago, that was already like a constant point of friction. And musicians, particularly, there's a gendered discourse of musicians needing to play up, to perform class, to look decent, so that they would not be mistaken for other kinds of Filipina migrants, specifically, sex workers and maids. So they self-managed, and they were managed by their agents quite rigorously about skirt length, about don't come in on time, come in 10 minutes early, so that when the manager sees you, you're just having your coffee and your makeup's done and you're ready to work, right? So these larger racial discourses of reputation, of collective reputation, kind of filtered down into very specific practices of self-management and notions of professionalism and class in music work.
This is play on the idea of solidarity between different types of Filipino workers.
Oh yeah. So it's so complex. So you have musicians like Samantha, who has both kind of personal. It's not completely innocent. She has very distinct reasons for professing her solidarity with Filipinos, because she is a very high-profile musician, who takes her job as a representative of Filipino culture quite seriously. And she's already kind of taken on that burden of representation herself, because she is such a high-profile performer. And she knows that her audience back in the Philippines would be kind of watching and assessing how she conducts herself as a professional overseas, right? Whereas you have many other musicians who are materially damaged by the association with other Filipinos, and who have, I think, equally valid reasons to distance themselves. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I was really attracted, as you were, to that line of that Filipinos are not black or white, they're not quite either, and so we can pay them a lot less.
Yeah.
And I'm just kind of curious if, because keeping that comparative kind of framework, how you kind of see that working with other groups of like non-white, non-brown, or like brownness, how brownness kind of functions, in the sense that you kind of expect the Filipino like entertainer to be in the background, like you said, that they're doing background music, and so it's not, but if a white person playing or perhaps a black person playing the same instruments, they might get the more attention, right? That and so it would be much more difficult to kind of just register them as background.
Right.
And then at the same time, you have like the lead singer of Journey now and things like that. But another interesting comparison, like I got my PhD in Seattle, and I would go to, because the students only had to pay $10 to go to the symphony hall, and so I'd go there all the time, but it was always East Asian performers or white performers, and that was it, and so not even black performers. But it was interesting now that you say that. It kind of brings to mind that even though like these cultures have this reputation of being so musical, it doesn't quite register in those different ways. And coming to like not so much Hong Kong, but like I lived in Taiwan for a bit. And there it was also known like these are the very musical people, that since that you go into a karaoke room, everyone will be better singers than you.
Yeah.
But it didn't. But transnationally, it was read in a completely different way, right? That they're not the entertainers; they're the ones who go to the symphony halls. Right? Yeah. I don't know if you can speak to that.
Well, I don't know if I can.
Well, I can speak to that with an anecdote. I conducted fieldwork in Macau at a 5-star hotel where somebody had referred me to a Filipina singer who was working with a multiracial band. So the band leader, so there were 2 Black Americans. The guitarist was Irish, I believe. There was one Malay Chinese singer for the Chinese songs. And then there was the Filipino singer who looked more Filipino Chinese more than anything. And actually, she's a 2nd generation Hong Kong Filipino. So she spoke, she was a Cantonese local, who had a really kind of brassy early 90s kind of pop rock voice. She could sound black and she could sound white. So when I interviewed her afterwards, it was a club at a casino hotel. So you had some people who danced, and the sound system was built in such a way that the music kind of dominated the space for the night. So they were a featured band, but there really wasn't a lot of interaction. The Black American who was the band leader made an effort to engage with the audience. So he was like a party DJ in American house party style. He had that kind of very outgoing personality. But there was not really that much interaction. So I bring it up because I'm thinking of how, yes, the ambiguity of her looks made it seem like she didn't have if it were a Miss Universe contest, her costume was not distinct enough to say Philippines. But then when she sang, then that's when people noticed her. And of course she had the showstopper song. So and the band leader made sure to kind of drum it up that okay, we're gonna do a slow song now. And then she sang Alone by Heart. Right, and then she held the last note for like so of course people paid attention, right? So when I try to make the conceptual move of shifting the terms of listening to Filipino musicians from authenticity to flexibility, it forms part of that. The ambiguity of their racial identity and their willingness to play with that ambiguity, I think, is ironically what sets them apart. Yeah.
Anjeline, I just wanted to follow up on a couple points. First, maybe a comment on classical music. Of course, Cecile Lecade was a famous example of a pianist, and of course, I think that also has a link to the Imelda,
yeah.
right? So that's interesting, but it's of course also perhaps somewhat exceptional. There's of course the case of Miss Saigon. That's another famous case. But I wanted to ask a couple questions. One about going back to the question about the musical tradition in the Philippines, the role of English.
Oh yeah.
And you know, that as and it's something, if when you spend time in Thailand or Indonesia, you know, musicians sometimes struggle with English. That's different in the Philippines, given the colonial tradition, the U.S. Period. Interesting too how that's come up in the question of immigration to China. I don't know if you saw that. The Chinese were raising the issue about whether Filipinos could be seen as native speakers of English or not, and therefore whether professionals can come in with English-speaking qualifications or not. So that was one question. The second, I wanted to follow up on OPM, these, you know, the idea to brand Filipino music in Tagalog in the Philippines. And you know, it seems to have some successes domestically, as I understand it. I mean, OPM music is, I mean, I think the rebranding was useful. But my question actually focuses on a other group within OPM that seems to have sort of been left behind. And this is sort of the 60s, early 70s group, you know, groups like Asin, but also one of my favorite singers, Joey Ayala. And you know, the striking thing about Joey Ayala, who for me is kind of a musical icon, and you know, brought in a lot of indigenous music traditions into his songs, particularly based on his, you know, Mindanao heritage, is the relative lack of popularity. It seems. I mean, I've attended his concerts where, you know, there've been, you know, dozens there. You know, it depends on the context. Sometimes he'll have a big crowd. Particularly with others, but somehow maybe I'm overstating this, but it seems to be that sort of tradition that maybe has links to the movement traditions of the 60s and 70s, the sort of left movement, which had this sort of musical expression, and of course a lot of the songs of that period do have a political tone. I'm wondering if you could comment on sort of what happened to that tradition within the OPM.
Right. I'll answer that first. So it's interesting that Ayala is a very strong Duterte supporter.
Huh. Was from Davao, I guess.
Yeah. He doesn't come out and say it, but if you read his public Facebook posts, he makes very kind of provocative statements about how drugs are less dangerous than sugar, you know, and he employs his usual kind of subtle trickster perspective to the political struggle that we're dealing with right now. But it's interesting that I've never kind of considered how these musicians from the 60s and 70s could be considered left behind. I see the sense in that, but at the same time, I would decontextualize the causes of their relative status as underground artists, and see it as the Philippine domestic industry is very small, right? So there was a certain period, and I think these dynamics could be explained in terms of this whole notion of industrialization of music processes, which is a process that you can see in many other countries throughout the world. There was a period in the early 90s, in the heyday of these major labels, that took a chance on Joey Ayala, and there was the whole cultural kind of milieu of OPM rock bands, right? Getting signed left and right because people were hungry for that. But then that moment passed very quickly. It ended around 97 or 98. And then pretty soon it was completely decimated by the rise of digital music. Yeah? I would my observation would be that Joey Ayala has found an alternate career. He's a musician, and among certain groups that we may not consider as part of the mainstream consumer market, he holds like universally idolized status. Communities of NGO workers, the aging activists of the 60s and 70s. He has a strange alliance. It's more Gary Granada, the songwriter, than Joey Ayala. But Gary Granada has had quite a successful collaboration with a Catholic media company, Jesuit Communications, which has kind of recorded and published most of his music. And then you have another singer, a contemporary of theirs, Noel Cabangon, who wrote this earnest activist folk song, Kanlungan, which was taken up as a McDonald's commercial and which shot into popularity. Right? So I guess the trajectories of these musicians, even though we can look at them as a certain cohort, still have to be looked at on a granular level in terms of the decisions that they've made and the partnerships that they've chosen to foster in furthering their careers.
I once heard this stereotype that Filipinos are the blacks of Asia. They dance well, they sing well, they're good at sports.
Yeah.
How do the musicians you talk, have you looked into these similarities, this idea of second-class citizens just as entertainers? How do the musicians you talk to feel about these stereotypes? Do they feel indignant?
About being compared to...
Yeah, I mean, just as these kind of second-class ideas, just entertaining for wealthier, first-class citizens.
Well, I think most of them react quite positively being compared to Black American musicians. And there's a lot of, and I think some of the literature that tries to unpack, the significance of Filipino migrant musicians would immediately draw parallels with, primitivist depictions of Black Americans as naturally gifted or naturally, the musical native. I think that comparison works only up to a certain point. The histories, again, are completely different. Most of them, again, and I think the useful filter to use here would be the conceptual filter of what is a working musician, right? And then how does this filter of the working musician become transformed, and what kind of practices kind of pile up when you put it in the Filipino context. So when I present this research to popular music studies scholars, they don't see it as exceptional. For them, my research and my evidence kind of reinforces what they already know about the notion of the working musician, who doesn't really care whether they're performing for rich or poor people as long as they're getting paid and as long as they're respected. So then it becomes debates about, well, what are ethical conditions of work, right? So for Filipino musicians, we've seen that because they are systematically subordinated, many of them are very willing to put up with conditions that American musicians would not even touch with a 10-foot pole. And the interesting thing is that many Filipinos would say that, well, that's why we're better than the Americans, because we don't complain so much. Then it gets worked into their dynamics of reputation. So the two filters I would use for that sort of question would be, one, what is this whole notion, what are the politics of being a working musician, where this is your full-time gig and then you're living from contract to contract. So it's a different kind of professional trajectory. And then two, what is the labor economy that you're dealing with? Who are the people you're up against, and who are you competing with for your job? For live performance in Asia, it's always an interracial labor market. Yeah.
Ina?
I was thinking about the connection between the identity or like this practice of being a migrant worker and thinking about being performer of musician and the connection between that, because I think that maybe what you mentioned, that many people in Philippines would say, okay, I will go abroad and work as performer to help my families at home. And maybe because of this identity or like practice of many people, you would get different kind of people who decide to choose this kind of career. Because like from what I know from different countries is like when you decide to be an artist, this is like your dream, and you know that it's maybe not a stable job, so you will do maybe service jobs, even like other jobs like selling coffee or whatever, just to get there some time, right? To be this, your dream is to be a famous artist. But if you have this other, way of entering in the profession of, earning money and sending it back to the family, you might put yourself from the beginning from the different category and have very different expectations. So even if you have a potential and talent, you won't really go for it, right?
Yeah, yeah. There's a sense that to a certain extent, I agree 100% with what you said. One of the surprising findings that I stumbled onto talking to people was that before I started interviewing people, I assumed that they were already musicians, and then they decided to be migrants. But what I found, which kind of points to the evidence that this is now a migrant job, is that many people had a passing interest in music and decided to go at it full time because there was an economic opportunity. So it's the same kind of professionalization stream that you see for Filipino nurses, right? So why are there so many Filipino nurses around the world? Because they want to earn money abroad, not because they want to be nurses.
But I think like being nurse and going abroad, you know, for job. I know it from Poland, for example. That is very kind of normal. But I have never heard, for example, in Poland, that people would go somewhere to sing on the ships, as the idea to support their families.
Yeah, so
it's very special. In the Philippines.
I think what's special is not. I'm wary of kind of falling back on kind of cultural essentialist. Because Filipinos are so gifted and the Philippines is so poor. And then I have more confidence in saying that, well, the institutional structure is already there. So many agents who create the links between, okay, I'll go to this village and I'll look for promising bands and I'll train them and I'll pay for their visa fees and then I'll connect them to the employer abroad. Many of these agents are musicians themselves. Many of these agents also broker different kinds of workers. So the ironic thing with the Philippine kind of labor regime is that even though it's extremely difficult and expensive to become a migrant abroad, it doesn't deter. It actually encourages more people to become migrants. But then I had the same assumption coming in as you did, that the musicians who become migrants get funneled into that job because they don't want to be artists or they kind of interrupt it. But my own friends who started out on this topic, they had very active creative careers outside music and outside migrant work. And in fact, the migrant work enabled them to come back at a certain point and then set up a school or set up a band or set up a recording. So I guess I would caution against a very kind of too easy binary between an artist and a working musician, because for many people, not just in the Philippines, but you have, I think, I don't know why, but Shirley Temple comes to mind, right? Many of these child stars, right, become mega stars because they need to earn for their families. So it's not at all unique to the Philippines in that sense. Yeah.
I don't know a lot, but why? So I want to compare Philippines to, say, K-pop in Korea.
Yeah.
Because Philippines, the idea is very naturally talented.
Right.
They also speak English, but it doesn't seem that there's a reputation. Filipinos don't seem to have original songs that spread. Compared in Korean, it's not spoken nearly as much as English. So why do you think that Korea has been successful in this sense, while Philippines hasn't been able to spread its music?
Institutional dynamics. Korea, K-pop developed its industry, I think, to compete with, imitating and competing with the earlier Cantopop industry. Yeah. So they had the Korean, I don't know a whole lot about it, but I do know that the Korean governance of cultural production is really very top-down. So that plays a huge part in it. Yeah. And the top-down mechanism for the Philippines is to send entertainers. Yeah.
I think this animated discussion shows how interesting we found this topic, and although we were relatively few, I think we were all extremely interested. Thank you again for a fantastic talk.